kiss for you.
To answer the question in the title, which I forgot to do, I was mad rambling towards the end about how angry all this stuff makes me, basically. To answer the question in the title, the reason everything becomes so complicated is because a lot of the time when you're working in these large-scale teams and these large-scale, environments where you have to name products and set everything up, what ends up happening is you make a thing and you have all this product, you have all these ideas, and all of a sudden, 6 months to a year later when you have to do it all again, there's either a new team or a new person or a new standard or something, and you do it based off that, and you just keep doing that and keep compounding. And there's a saying in security and sort of this whole idea that if you're trying to consolidate all these standards with a new standard, it's just going to add to the pile, right? You're never really going to consolidate things. And you can very easily see that with things like TVs and how complicated TVs are getting, with stuff like how complicated processors are getting, and what the difference between each of them are and where their layout and where they stand. You can see that in even stuff that you think is simple, like, computer, or not simple, but more simple, like Apple, where it has all this stuff and it lays it out perfectly for you. And look at this, it's all nice and big and, fun kind of, layout and all this stuff. And even that has some stuff underneath it that, they don't really talk about, because even they forget, oh yeah, the MacBook Air doesn't have a fan. Don't need to say that anywhere in this long-ass description of anything. No, I'm not going to tell you that at all. You have to, watch a review by some other person to figure that one out. It's just kind of ridiculous. But, yeah, ultimately, I think the reason that everything becomes so complicated is because we just keep adding and adding and adding, and we never get away. And, processors are a great example. It's like, oh, what's that 11th gen processor? Oh, it's useless. The 12 is out. The 13's out. The 14's out. The 15's out. We have a new Ultra line. We have the Atom line that no one uses. We have the Celeron line that no one uses. We have the Inside line that no one uses, right? It just keeps adding and adding, and they're all for different things. Technically, it's like, oh, this is ideal for AI computing. This is ideal for gaming. This is ideal for everyday performance. This one's really efficient or for enthusiasts. It's like, it becomes a lot. And the reason it becomes a lot, and the reason people that are more consumer minded, let's just say, don't think about it and don't understand it, is because they can't. They see the wall, they see the list, they see these giant charts. They see the giant chart, and they just freak out and they leave. Because things keep adding and piling on, and stuff never gets reduced. That's ultimately the reason nothing ever gets reduced. So now I spend the rest of the video setting all this up and talking about it even more. Hopefully you enjoy. So I overheard a conversation yesterday talking about this person getting their first computer or laptop for college, and kind of wondering, what they wanted and all that, and they ultimately decided they wanted a MacBook, and they wanted the Pro because at the time the Pro had the Touch Bar, and they thought the Touch Bar was pretty cool, and they wanted kind of experience, but they were originally looking at a MacBook Air. And what was really interesting, as someone who's in this space constantly and thinking about laptops and technology and all that and up to date on all the latest advances and stuff, is that they mentioned they did not hear or understand about the difference between the Air and the Pro. And this was, I would say, because it's the Touch Bar and all that, 2019 or so, 2020, around the start of the pandemic, when they updated the Pro and the Air specifically to be more like the Pro. As you can see from the screenshot, it's pretty similar, and so they ended up going with the Pro because of the Touch Bar, but they didn't understand the difference between the Air and the Pro, when to me, someone that has been in this and all that, understands pretty clearly the difference between the Air and the Pro. But looking back on things like Apple's website and from the general information that they provided, it's quite difficult unless you follow video reviews or written reviews about the product to really understand the differences. Even in written reviews, it's kind of hard because it's not necessarily front and center of those reviews. So I'll give you an example here. If I go onto the Apple website and I'm comparing Mac models, and I compare the latest 13-inch MacBook Air to the latest 14-inch MacBook Pro, both in the M3 processor, you'll see that they look pretty similar from a display perspective. They also look pretty similar from a sizing perspective. You can see the Pro's a little thicker, but, same overall shape, same lip here, same screen. And these are, both selected as the M3 models. You can see this one starts at about 1100 and this one starts at 1600. So immediately you're like, okay, well, there's a pretty big difference between something like, 1100 and 1600, especially with taxes and anything like that. So that's a pretty big $500 jump. What are you getting for that 500? And if you look down, you see, okay, you're getting a larger screen a little bit. You're getting what's called a Liquid Retina XDR display. So as someone that might know something about HDR, you might say, okay, this Liquid Retina display must not be HDR, and this one probably is, meaning this one might have, brighter levels of brightness or something like that, maybe more colors, but overall, this Liquid Retina should be pretty good, and we'll check out that 9 and 8 in a second. As you can see, they both say they have the M3 chip on it. They both have 8 cores, 10 GPU threads, 24 gigs of memory, up to 2 terabytes of storage. You can see the Pro technically might have a little bit longer battery life. Liquid Retina XDR doesn't really tell you much other than the fact that, as we kind of predicted, this one has a slightly higher resolution, and it has XDR brightness, so it was higher brightness, so you could kind of glean that. The extra pixel density might probably just be because of that larger screen size, right? There's nothing necessarily saying that it's a higher quality screen. Both have P3 color gamut and True Tone, and this one has ProMotion, which is 120 hertz. So like overall, if you're looking at this and you're looking at the specs, you're going to say, okay, the specs of this one, if you want the HDMI port, you want the higher quality screen and maybe the higher quality speakers, you're going to, and the ProMotion stuff, you're ultimately going to get this model because those $500 features, they seem like it makes sense. What they're not going to tell you is that the MacBook Air doesn't have a fan, and the MacBook Air also has a lower clocked processor by default. These aren't going to be things that you know on the spec sheet, but are going to drastically affect your purchase decision on the Pro model. If I need something that has a fan, like I'm doing a lot of photo editing or a lot of video editing or a lot of compiling, I'm going to want the Pro model instead of the Air model, because the Air model doesn't have a fan, so it ends up having to clock more and become louder, which obviously affects things like battery, and it affects heat generation, dissipation, and all that. And so ultimately you're going to have a worse experience and slow down and stuff if you do those applications. And this comparison doesn't tell you that. All these specs, and I go through all this, and it might seem excessive, and if you don't understand this, it's all gobbledygook. But even with this level of detail that some people might find excessive, you still don't get to understand the actual differences between these two devices. And this is not something that is just Apple. This is something that is plaguing the entire industry. I'm obviously going to talk about USB for a second, because that's kind of important. This whole mess of hell is, I'm not even going to try to explain it because they just keep changing stuff. But there's a saying in security and cybersecurity that also kind of pertains to anything you're doing that has some kind of not government, but some kind of consortium or standards oversight, is you have 15 standards and you need to make some way to combine the standards because they're too complicated or too confusing or too much, and we need some way to unify them into one coherent thing. So you make a standard, the documentation that's going to be, this is the standard for all standards, to kind of move around and be under the same umbrella. And now we have 16 standards instead of 15, because that one standard to unify is just another standard you add on to the pile. That is fundamentally what happens with a lot of these kind of systems. And you can easily see it with something like USB versions, where you have, the standard USB 1, USB 2, USB 3, 3.1, 3.2, and then all of a sudden, because you need to change your bandwidth speeds and getting higher, but then you also need to change, data speeds, but then you also need to change if it's USB-C or not, and then you need to change, does it support power, does it support GPU, does it support, external graphics cards and displays and storage and stuff. You have to figure out, what do I need to include and what don't I include? And the USB consortium decided, okay, not only are we increasing the bandwidth speed, but we're going to make optional some important things, like, the fact that it can support an external GPU, right? That's kind of a thing that you take for granted on something like Thunderbolt that just kind of has it by default. Well, now, if you're a USB 3.2 Gen 2x2 Super Speed Plus, you have the 20 gigs that you need to actually support something like that, and the icon looks like this, and the connector is the same connector for everyone. That's not that helpful, especially when USB 3.2 Gen 2x2 Super Speed Plus, with this stupid ass logo that no one uses, is the only one that supports 20 gigs on this model. If I do USB 3.2 Gen 2 Super Speed Plus, that's also called Super Speed Plus USB 3.1, it's only 10 gigs. You got that? USB 3.2 Gen 2 Super Speed Plus is actually USB 3.1 at 10 gigs, which is half of what the typical 20 gig one is. Literally half. So if you needed something higher and you got 3.2 that was Gen 2 instead of Gen 2x2, you did the wrong thing. That's horrifying, basically. That's awful. And this applies to, again, other types of technology. Not only does it apply to laptops, it applies to processors. This whole hellscape. Intel just released their new processors, the Core Ultra series and the normal Core series, which is different from their Core series, which is different from their processor series. This is the old stuff. This is like the Celeron, the Atoms, the like really cheap stuff you find in like Chromebooks and stuff. This is the previous generational naming scheme, the 12, 13, 14 series processor. Then they decided, okay, for this new 15th Meteor Lake system, we're going for a different core system. So then we have Intel Core processors Series 1, which are categorically worse than the normal core processors that people already are aware of. And then the Core Ultra, which again, you might say, oh, they're going to, Gen 15, we're just calling it the Core Ultra series. Wrong. These are also worse than the normal 14th gen processors. Except for they have special AI and image computing. So they have very specific chips in them that help with AI image computation and other AI abilities that are relatively important if you want to do things like graphics on this. So like the graphics processing in the Core Ultra series is a little bit better than the 14th gen. But critically, these are only, I think, right now on mobile, which is also annoying. It's like, it used to be the delineation was your 14th gen processors had like a G attached to it, or a P attached to it. So you'd have, for example, 1165 G7. The 1165 G7 was a mobile processor, and I know that because it has that G7. This was 11th gen, but it had the G7 next to it, and it was 1165, and they had this whole chart, right? And so you can see that this is a mobile segment processor because it has this delineation. All of a sudden, you get rid of that delineation, and then you just have Intel Core Ultra 155H. Intel Core Ultra 7 processor 155H. This is also a mobile processor with 155H as the tag name, right? And this is their flagship mobile processor. But all of a sudden, you can't tell that it's a mobile processor. Intel Core Ultra 7 processor is going to stay the same no matter what it's in, 155H. Now, I can only assume that maybe once they release these as desktops, that it's going to have this H removed, or maybe they're not even going to use this at all, which might help, but I don't think it will. This still complicates things because now you have two different setups. Instead of having like a 13700 M or a 13700 G or P series, because it used to be G as like grand and P as performance, and so it was like, okay, the P ones would be in the lower end systems, but more higher end than the like Celeron ones that are in like the really cheap stuff. But now instead of that, we have this Core Ultra series that has better AI stuff, but isn't really comparable. Like, they're just not as comparable. 6 performance cores, 8 efficiency cores, 2 low power efficiency cores, 16 overall cores, which is, technically an improvement, but it becomes complicated when you're trying to compare that directly with something else, some other kind of processing, like the 14th gen, right? I don't even know what their 14th gen mobile stuff is called. Quick, did they have a name, or were they, not to be confused with the Core Ultra processors for laptops, the 14th gen variants are refreshed to the Raptor Lake mobile versions. So they're different, right? I actually didn't know this. I just assumed the Core ones kind of replaced the 14th gen ones, but apparently there's still 14th gen processors like the 4900 HX, which is the high performance extreme, whatever the heck you want to call it. That's different than the Core Ultra CPUs, which you might think, and for a lot of laptops, like if you go to Dell, the new XPS line, if you go to the new XPS line, they have the Core Ultra processors in them. Not these. These are the old 3900H. There it is, up to Ultra, whatever. This is the 14th. It's $1,500. This is $1,650. This is a higher end machine, and it has the 3900H. The previous generations, doesn't really matter, but the previous generation's mobile processing version at the top here. compared to this 14-inch laptop's Ultra thing. As you can see, it also has way weaker graphics. So this is kind of like an Ultrabook, and this is kind of like a more heavy-duty laptop, right? Because it can have a higher-end one of these. And so you may say, okay, this is kind of slotting underneath something like the mobile line right here. And well, you would technically be correct that it slots underneath it. That doesn't really help the mobile processing case much, because now you have a really weird disparity between, you're not going to care about this at all, because most likely you don't have a comparison point. For this, if this is all that these types of machines, which I talked about in my video on computer basics, which talks about TVs and laptops and RAM and everything you need to know about any of that stuff. I also talked about this when I was talking about how to pick the right laptop. And it's the fact that when you don't have a comparison between what you can get and what are the options, if everything just says Intel Core Ultra 5, 7, whatever, you're not going to have any comparison point. I can't compare an Intel Core 7 Ultra with an Intel Core i9-3900H because they use different metrics to gauge their quality, as you can clearly see by this thing here. If we're just gauging based on the previous one, the processors would be the best. However, if in this Ultrabook thing, this might be better on battery life. It's not, spoiler alert, it runs hotter and isn't good on battery life. You don't know that because unless you look up specifically for this, you're not going to get a context point. Right? It's the equivalent of saying, oh, we sell apples, we're selling apples, apples are great, all of a sudden we're going to sell pomegranates. And it's like, that's nice, pomegranates are cool, I now buy pomegranates, but what happened to my apples? Where are the apples? Where do they go, right? That's a horrible analogy, but it's just this idea that like you're used to one thing, now you have this other thing, and you don't have context for the other thing. You don't have like the apple seller is really good at selling apples, and they have quality apples all year round. All of a sudden, they're selling pomegranates. You don't know if their pomegranates are good or if they're rotten, right? So it's kind of one of those things, and you can kind of see that with these newer laptops that come out. They have worse reviews than the other laptops. Now, obviously, that's not all to do with the processor, but a part of it is, hey, we're changing processor. Did we change the chassis? No. Do we change how it's structured and the heating? No. So obviously, what do you think is going to happen, right? I didn't want to make this video too long, but the other thing I wanted to talk about real quick is it happens with TVs too. If you notice, I just kind of want the four things were, computers, laptops, TVs, the USB standards of everything, right? Ratings is a great system for TVs and basically anything you could want for reviews, and they have a great ratings system here, and they talk about it. But there's a lot of information here, and if you're just trying to look at ratings and you look at this and it's like, oh my god, it's amazing for mixed use. Look how good it is for blah 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 blah. And you have your one con here is it's a notable green tint, and you look at comparisons to other TVs. It's just there's so much information here. And if you don't know exactly what you want, I just want an OLED TV. What's the best OLED TV? All I'm looking for on an OLED TV is it needs to be bright and it needs to last a while, right? Because most likely if you're buying an OLED and you're not super informed, all you know is OLEDs look really good. I have the blacks and stuff, and OLEDs are, pretty bright, and they look really bright in the storerooms and stuff, and so you want that, and that's all you know. And so you go on this page and look through, TVs, and you see that this is great, but then you also see that this is pretty similar for something like the G line right here, and you check, prices, and you see that the 55-inch for this one is $2,600, and the 55-inch for this one is $2,000, and you're like, damn, that's $600. Where's that $600 going? And then you might look at something like the comparisons, and it's comparing the G3, which isn't being sold anymore, and saying, oh, the G3 is a better TV overall with better HDR content and handling glare better. Then it automatically switches to the G4. It's like, oh, and the G4 is better color volume and blah blah blah. But there's a difference between the G3 and the G4. So when they say, oh, they reference the G3 here, and then they reference the G4 here, to someone like me that's aware of the fact that the G3 and G4 aren't that much different, this is fine. But to most people, and even to me, when it has something like it's talking about the G3 and it's comparing it and it has all these features, and then all of a sudden it talks about the G4, and I go to the G3 and it says, hey, it's replaced by the G4. Like there's things here that just kind of disappear, right? If I was looking at this TV and I was like, okay, I want a G, it's like I don't want a C4, I want a G4 or a G3, and I'm gonna go to the G3 and click on it, and then as it's saying all these benefits, it's like, yeah, that sounds good, and you go and you realize, oh, it's not being sold anymore, and you click on this one, and you don't also then look to see what's been improved and what the changes are. You might forget, oh, this TV doesn't have high refresh rate, right? Because that's a thing that they talk about in the C4. They talk about it here. However, the C4 supports 144 Hz, so it's better for those looking to get the most out of their powerful gaming PCs. If you don't remember or look at this line that's talked about in the comparison to the G3, you are never going to remember that the C4 is 144 Hz, and the G3, that's now the G4 that you clicked on, doesn't do that, right? You can look at here, you can all that. It's not in a con or anything. If you look back at it in a comparison, the G4 is better HDR, so there's less banding, and it supports 144 Hz. Yeah, it was talking about it, and it's like, oh, the C4 supports this, and so that means that the G4 maybe doesn't. Like, it gets quite confusing when you're looking at this and you don't understand what's happening, right? And even I'm like, wait, what supports what? So C4 supports 144 Hz. The G3 doesn't seem like it does, but the G4 does. Gotta keep track of those little things. And this is a site that literally compiles everything, so it's as easy as possible to do this, and it's still extremely difficult. So I kind of just wanted to talk about it and see kind of, start a discussion on what other products you've seen this happening to that are maybe in a different space than I'm not as familiar with. So yeah, if any of you have any of that, maybe in the fitness space or in, the business space, then you can definitely shout those out, and I'll check them out. So yeah, hope you enjoy, and I'll see everyone in the next video.